Hello! Today I'm going to be taking a look at one of the more understated Final Fantasy games of days gone by, Final Fantasy VI. As the last instalment to utilise the traditional top-down RPG tilesets and character sprites, the legacy of Final Fantasy VI has arguably been somewhat eclipsed by the revelatory milestone of its 3D successor, Final Fantasy VII, leaving it comparatively buried when it comes to mentions in official gaming histories and discourses. Despite this, however, the game has a strong following among Final Fantasy fans and frequently ranks as a favourite of the series for many. With a recent release on Steam and also across mobile devices, we've seen a mild resurgence and interest and also controversy around Final Fantasy VI. And today I'll be taking a dive into this instalment and the contributing factors that make it rank alongside, and arguably in many respects even supersede its successors. To prefix this talk, I'd just like to say a quick thank you to my subscribed listeners for their kind comments and continued contributions they make to my channel, and I can only apologise that my output is so few and far between, despite my best intentions. If you're a first-time listener and you decide you enjoy the show, I'd really appreciate a like, a share or a subscribe, and this simple click of a button will help my channel grow and keep you informed of my latest posts. And as always, feel free to comment below with discussion points regarding the game, particularly if you think I'm wrong, because I really love kind of hashing out ideas and theories pertaining towards these games. So, Final Fantasy VI. Now, for my part, generationally, I missed the boat on Final Fantasy VI's original release, simply because I didn't own a SNES, and I didn't pick up the game until its PlayStation re-release back in 2002, and I'm quite ashamed to admit that although I found the story compelling upon its re-release, as a youth acclimatised to the graphical superiority of PlayStation 1, I did have trouble immersing myself into it the same way I would have perhaps a decade previously when I was playing those earlier consoles. Fast forwarding to today, I now own the game on Steam, and I was surprised to find the graphics have been overhauled and optimised for today's marketplace, particularly the mobile market, which the Steam version seems to be quite lazily adapted from for PC gamers, so it still retains a lot of the mobile UI and shortcuts and stuff, which doesn't quite meld with the PC gamers format. But along with this port style, the overhaul and the retranslations that have been done, with some considerable criticism from fans of the original title, and there's entire articles online dedicated to a comparison of the pixel count and the downsizing and the visual clarity of old versus new, which each have their pros and cons in my opinion. And I won't get into the intricacies of that here, but for my part I'll say I wasn't too offended by the updated version of Final Fantasy VI graphically. I think it's a good middle ground for introducing current generation gamers to this instalment. But I will say, I was playing on a laptop in a Windows screen, and when I kind of upscaled the new version to, my desktop screen, I could really see where the flaws in the downsizing of the artwork came in. Finally, also regarding the reworked character portraits, which also came under fire, I actually found them to be neat homages to Yoshitaka Amano's original artwork, and I think they were given a renewed clarity to them, which works well on modern devices and sort of brought them into the 21st century a bit more. So just a final note on the graphics here. I'm interested to know how many current generation and particularly younger gamers played and liked this game. I find it really interesting that some 18 and 19-year-olds have commented on my videos saying they really liked playing Final Fantasy VII despite the dated graphics, which somewhat contradicts my previous assumptions that gamers are largely drawn to graphics and gameplay that are contemporary to their generation and beyond, rather than going back to the retro stuff. And the visual gulf between Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII is actually quite monumental. So I'm interested to see who could acclimatise to this and really get into this, rather than taking it at face value. Classifying this Final Fantasy game, I would say that every Final Fantasy previous to this, so 1 through to 5, might be considered as the old school of Knights and Mages Final Fantasy game, which were directed by Hironobu Sakaguchi and built aesthetically in a very conventional tileset, pixel-based format. in my personal chronology of the games, I generally batch Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII together as an innovative turning point, being suffixes to the traditional Final Fantasy games, and putting the games in a renewed direction up until the Square Enix merger. The directorial helm of Final Fantasy VI was partly taken up by Yoshinori Kitase, who went on to direct Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy X, and also Chrono Trigger. And with Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII in particular, they were very revelatory in terms of narrative, character story arcs, graphics, and marked a transition point from what the franchise had been to what it would go on to become. In terms of themes, which are obviously very important looking at each singular instalment of the Final Fantasy games, I look at Final Fantasy VI as having themes that hinge around division and duality. If it were a symbol, it would be a yin-yang, because many story arcs, characters, and even geographies and societal demographics hinge around binary oppositions and polarizing differences that are often housed or embodied within a single entity, which may sound like a crazy theory, but let's look at some examples here. So we have old versus new exhibited through industrialization and aesthetic traditions. Castle Figaro, for example, is this technological marvel, that kind of moves underground and buries itself and moves, that's housed within a very aesthetically medieval castle. So that's a clear duality between old and new. We have past versus present, embodied in characters like Locke, whose entire raison d'etre in the present hinges around, his living in the past and suffering with this loss of Rachel, which happened years before the events of the game. We have TERRA, who is half human, half Esper. So again, clear duality of opposing forces here. And we have CELES, who is torn between her role within the Empire and the plight of the Returners. And finally, we have the brothers EDGAR and SABIN, who are representative of the pragmatic, logical, industrialized modern man on the one hand, and the impulsive physicality, spirituality, and more nature-inclined person on the other. We also have the world of balance, which is a poignant symbol because, of course, balance by its nature is an equality between opposing forces, like the aforementioned yin-yang. And we also have the cataclysmic world of ruin as an opposing geographical game segment. So this also plays on the geographical dualism that is apparent in the game, and once again is a clear indicator that this central motif and theme of Final Fantasy VI is duality and opposition and binaries. And basically, as we go through and discuss the game, I'll refer back to these where relevant, so we can see just how permeable it is in the game events. A second thematic quality, which is again quite a subtle thread across many Final Fantasy games, is the dramatic industrialization and technological innovation that takes place across the world, not just through tinkering engineers such as EDGAR, but through the behemoth of the Empire's war machine and the Magitech army that's being developed by Cid, who basically discovers a way to extract magic from sentient espers and imbue machines and humans with their powers. Interestingly, Kefka, who I'll discuss in depth later, is the first experiment of Cid's, and while he gained unassailable power, he lost his sanity in the process and became the central antagonist of the game. So both the plot points of destroying nature for technological advancement and creating a monster from scientific experimentation could be considered a blueprint for later plot points of Final Fantasy VII, of course involving the Shinra and Sephiroth respectively. But saying that, it doesn't dilute the poignance they offer in Final Fantasy VI by any stretch, and Final Fantasy VI was delivered fantastically with one of the best main story arcs and antagonists we've probably seen come out of the franchise. So, further to the themes, the setting we find ourselves in it not only reflects this steampunk come medieval blending of industrialization versus tradition, which echoes, of course, across later Final Fantasies as well, 7 through to 15, But also, this Final Fantasy takes a distinctly European and chiefly Italian Renaissance slant in much of its aesthetics and naming conventions. For example, we have the city of Figaro, which is a popular Italian naming convention in many plays and literature. Kefka's surname, Palazzo, is etymologically Roman for palace. TERRA is etymologically Latin and resides in both Italian and Portuguese languages, and it means the word earth, basically. And there's a myriad of other examples where clearly Western and particularly South European and Mediterranean names are used. Not always to great effect, I might add, because giving such an enigmatic and mysterious character as TERRA the painfully average surname of BRANFORD seemed somewhat anticlimactic for me, but I think it's just a prudent reminder that Final Fantasy games are, of course, Japanese, and the consistent use of Latin words throughout the series is probably because these things seem so foreign to the Japanese. It's almost like how mystical the East is to us, is how the West is to them. So where we have these kind of quite familiar Latin terms and Romance terms used throughout Final Fantasy games, we have to remember that primarily they were made for a Japanese audience, particularly back in the earlier installment days. Turning to the story, Final Fantasy VI is probably the turning point for the franchise, and the moment that story and character really eclipsed gameplay and graphics in terms of the appeal of these games, and RPGs in general, which is something that has arguably since reverted back over the past 10 years or so. But such was the size and scale and intrigue of the narrative ambition of Final Fantasy VI, it can't really be understated, what a milestone this was for the gaming industry. In terms of characters and story arcs, those familiar with the tight-knit quartet of friends in Final Fantasy XV would be shocked at the sheer size of the cast in this game. If we include the temporary party members, there's around 15 party members, ranging from a friendly ghost on the Phantom Train to the elusive Shadow and the temperamental Gore, who flirt with their allegiance to the grand cause of the Returners. As previously mentioned, this posits Final Fantasy VI as a complex ensemble of intertwining narratives that contrasts heavily with latter installments such as 8, 10 and 15, which sees characters striving collectively with the same agenda and the same end goal. By comparison, 6 balances a range of arcs and emotions from Terra's discovery of her origins to CYAN's desire for revenge to Locke's redemption tale and CELES' conflicted allegiances. Each character brings something to the table in varying degrees, and as such there's plenty to explore and uncover when it comes to propelling these respective stories forward. This is a really neat endeavour undertaken by Squaresoft, during its golden age, and to achieve such a varied ensemble, they very, very purposely encouraged staff to come up with characters and stories on their own before they came together and strategically wove everything together into a grander story. Through the overarching narrative, we initially see what amounts to the familiar Final Fantasy stomping ground of ruthless imperialism invading the free world. The Star Wars-esque Imperials versus the Alliance is a popular story device throughout most Final Fantasies, and it sits comfortably as the premise of Final Fantasy VI-2. But perhaps no other game is fraught with such instant tension in terms of the prevalence of this evil force and its ruthless pursuit of our heroes right from the beginning of the game. The first half of the story sees our protagonists largely on the back foot, struggling to stay one step ahead of the expanding empire and the maniacal Kefka. It sets a compelling pace for the story and sees us move about and discover world map locations faster than any subsequent game I've played. We shift sharply from the introductory segment at Nash to Figaro, and then several more locations once the party splits at the Leith River. So we not only have this early geographical exploration, but again Final Fantasy VI establishes a firm ensemble cast rather than one key hero, which I'll talk about once we get to the characters. The first half of the game peaks around the time we discover the Warring Triad, which prompts the cataclysmic turning point of the main story. like other game installments, Final Fantasy VI borrows some common religious connotations, and in this instance, the power of three, or the concept of the triple deity, seems to have been alluded to with the warring triad concept. You know, much like the Christian notion of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, or the three principal Hindu gods, Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, and Shiva the destroyer, the warring triad are a violent precursor to the world that we eventually find ourselves in, and their battles against one another inadvertently turned humans to Espars, providing further context and history to the setting of Final Fantasy VI. Now, this game is one of the... it's only a handful of examples that do this, but this is one of the few games where we actually witness the bad guys win, and Kefka manages to cause a cataclysm that basically destroys the world. So the doom and gloom is quite pervasive, and compared to games like 7, 8 and 9, where the end of days event is looming, and it's on the cusp of devastation, but it's eventually prevented by our heroes. You know, indeed, Final Fantasy IX is undoubtedly the most light-hearted Final Fantasy in this regard, because not only do we ultimately win, but we also see the main antagonist, Kuja, redeem himself during the closing act. And I think it's only really Final Fantasy XV that I can think of that's comparable to Final Fantasy VI in this regard, as it transports us to a future where the antagonist has succeeded and the world has irrevocably altered for the worse. Turning now to the characters, I'm going to move into the character analysis because, firstly, I've been told numerous times that I talk too much, and secondly, I don't want to provide too many spoilers because people have commented before saying that I've spoiled the game, and I feel really guilty. So I'm going to focus only on the core characters of this game due to time and prominence, and I don't think I've managed to keep any of my Final Fantasy essays under an hour, which isn't helping their appeal, and I'm endeavouring to do now. So, in Final Fantasy VI, much of the Empire's conquest throughout the game hinges around their pursuit of summonable deities known as Espers, and it's here that we see another trope in Final Fantasy emerge, which is that of an ancient and marginalised race which has become almost extinct due to the relentless push of Empire and modernity, much like Yuna and Riku, representing the marginalised Al-Bhed in Final Fantasy X, or Ares representing the extinct ancients in Final Fantasy VII, or indeed Garnet representing the long-forgotten summoners in Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy VI sees the first playable character to appear on stage, which is TERRA, as the enigmatic heroine, bridging past with present and humanity with the supernatural. So, I've alluded to previously that Final Fantasy VI is an ensemble game, and as such it's quite hard to pin down a central character. Indeed, you ultimately get narrative depth and exploration out of whoever you choose to hold in your party most prominently, but suffice to say, many fans hinge the game around TERRA or Locke or CELES, and sometimes even EDGAR and SABIN. And on this note, it's prudent to note that the Final Fantasy VI logo comprises of TERRA in her Magitech armour, and she is the one who ushers us into the world and the setting of Final Fantasy VI. So I can see how one might lean towards her centrality of this instalment, and furthermore her relationship between the two decisive races of humanity and Esper are a central plot point around which much of the game hinges. So, she does have a degree of significance to her. Now, we find her at the beginning of the game controlled by the Slave Crown. We are thrown into the action and the ambiguity of her situation, and her relationship to the Empire, with Biggs and Wedge providing an excellent opening dialogue which contextualises TERRA as somewhat unearthly and unaligned to the interests of the Empire, were it not for her hypnotism. And shortly thereafter, her awakening at the hands of the Esper alludes to her affinity to these beings, and also her fragile and constantly threatened demeanour, which prevails throughout the majority of the Final Fantasy VI story. Her journey, I think, hinges around loneliness and the pursuit of meaning, which is captured brilliantly by her theme song, Nobuo Uematsu provided for this game. And in many ways, this plight of hers makes her the obligatory female enigma, such as Ares from 7 or Garnet from 9. As the game progresses, we find her interaction with Espers a tantalising precursor to her eventual reveal as a half Esper, half human. And returning to the theme of duality I mentioned earlier, TERRA embodies this perfectly with her conflicting heritage and shifting physical appearances between her human self and her trance Esper form. Despite this mystical female stereotype she sits within, it's also prudent to note that TERRA is an interesting break from the mould, in that she evolves to become a maternal rather than a romantic foil for a male counterpart. Her romantic impotence, which has its own subtle plot points in this game, breaks from not just Final Fantasy conventions, but the wider expectation of Western mythic, folk and fairy tale lore, which I really quite like. And on that, what I mean with that is, if we look at any, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, they all hinge around a romantic conclusion, and I really like that TERRA has broken from this mould as a central character. As soon as Locke rescues TERRA and swears to protect her, I assumed it would go down this route of a conventional love story, but we see that Locke's offers of protection are symptomatic of his regrets, which I'll discuss shortly, and aren't unique to TERRA as a person or as a romantic foil for him. TERRA also has much more affinity with fleeting secondary characters like General Leo, who assures her that she is capable of feeling emotions, later in the game, which is one of her personal crises which she has to tackle with throughout the events of this game. Ultimately, TERRA develops to become a maternal rather than romantic figure, which is great. Her love for the children of Moblise serve as her raison d'etre at the end of the game, and the love story is reserved for, Locke and CELES, despite all initial indications. Finally, just looking at the slightly amusing etymology and reasoning behind TERRA's name, which I think I've touched upon. She was originally slated to be called Tina Branford in the western port of the game, which for an English-speaking audience doesn't sound very mystical at all. But thanks to the controversial translator Ted Woolsey, who is, somewhat controversial for taking liberties with his source material, he pushed for the translation of her name to be Terra, which is Latin for Earth, and has a much more mystical vibe to it to an English-speaking audience. So, turning next to Locke, who is the second key character we're introduced to, on the surface we see a happy-go-lucky thief, or treasure hunter, as he frequently attempts to posit himself. But again, with the theme of duality at play, we see Locke harbours a deep sadness that contrasts strongly with his surface-level, affable nature, and through his inability to reconcile with the regrets of his past, which prompts him to have joined the Returners in the first place in an effort to try and wrestle this guilt from himself. Indeed, the psychology of regret is deep-seated and all-consuming, when we look at Locke, and it's to the extent that it is debilitating and an altering aspect of his personality. Among the main causes of regret from a psychological perspective are inaction or action, basically a moment in time that the sufferer looks back to where a decision was taken that echoed out towards a negative outcome, and their inability to kind of get over that. And looking at Locke's character, we can append this to perhaps two key instances. The first being his inaction, his inability to look after Rachel during their visit to Mount Colts, or perhaps even it was the action of taking her there in the first place that is the first and most prominent cause of his regret. A second prominent cause of regret is a lost opportunity, and this is apparent in Locke's regret again in a second instance which concerns Rachel, and that is of course her death at the hands of Imperial troops. And of course this happens while he's exiled from the town. So the fact he didn't get to see or speak to her for so long, and the fact that he failed to save her in these two instances, has severely altered his personality and his character, which is evident in two key ways beneath his surface level charisma. Firstly, he's joined the Returners, and this is an arbitrary response to the fact that Rachel was killed by the Empire. So, much like Barrett from Final Fantasy VII, who basically joins Avalanche as a vehicle for his revenge against Shinra, Locke joins the Returners as an actionable and violent response to the Empire, killing Rachel, which he is actually eventually quite forthcoming about. Secondly, in each instance we see a female character in distress in the game, particularly with TERRA and CELES. Locke goes out of his way in an attempt to protect them, oft times when it's not even required. The women in question, of course, are an enhanced Magitech Knight and, again, a Magitech General for the Empire. One thing I really liked, actually, looking at Locke's regret and his inability to get over the past and, this kind of weight he drags around with him, is the fact that Rachel, physically, Rachel's presence is in Collinheim during the game events. And I think this is symbolic of her spiritual and mental presence in Locke's mind. Her stasis, hovering between life and death, is emblematic of Locke's inability to let her go and forgive himself of these regrets. So it's a very literal representation of grief that we see play out in Locke's narrative, and ultimately, towards the end of the game, his confrontation with this grief is presented literally as well, which is when we see the Phoenix Esper briefly resurrecting Rachel, just long enough for him to get closure and assuage him of this guilt that permits him then to move on with his life. I think it's a very touching moment, and it shows how Final Fantasy VI as a game really pushed the boundaries with character growth and story, and worked with some quite hard-hitting themes and narratives, in these individual character subplots. Finally, just noting on the etymology of Locke's name, it seems like it could relate to the philosopher John Locke, due to the spelling, which is identical and quite uncommon, and it's also in keeping with Square's infrequent forays into cultural naming conventions and philosophical naming conventions as well, because of course we have a few instances. One that jumps out at me right at the moment is Heidegger from Final Fantasy VII, which is of course named after another philosopher, and quite an uncommon Germanic name. Having said that, there's no direct parallels or anything symbolic that I can find between John Locke's writings that I could argue, can be appended to Locke as a reason for his name. But I would argue that the philosopher did believe and wrote about the fundamental goodness of mankind. He believed in ethical and moral goodness, which he wrote about extensively. And this is certainly a belief that we could say Locke in Final Fantasy VI does subscribe to. So, yeah, ultimately quite an abstract but not impossible, theory for why this naming convention may have occurred. Turning next to CELES, we see the counterpart to Locke's storyline, and off the back of discussing him and these regrets, I think it actually impacts her character growth quite a lot as well, because she frequently considers whether Locke is merely projecting these regrets onto her, using her as a surrogate Rachel that he can somehow save, rather than confronting the reality of his loss. So this is interesting because CELES, as a turncoat, as a interesting, confused sort of character in terms of her allegiances, it plays quite well into her insecurities, about who she is and what she stands for. Her proficiencies in the Empire contend with her humanity and morality, and much like Ketchi from Final Fantasy VI, she's outed as a spy, but due to the freedom and the sincerity and her belief in goodness of the returners and what they embody, this prompts a change of heart in her and a switch of allegiance quite permanently for this character. Now, CELES is something of a fan favourite, and I mentioned in my Freya Crescent clip when discussing Final Fantasy IX that strong female leads are quite few and far between in Square titles, particularly the earlier ones, and CELES sits firmly in the realm of Beatrix and Freya and Lightning when it comes to this strength of will, and she firmly rebukes Locke's offers of protection due to her, feminine autonomy and her skills. And this is particularly stark as well when we compare her to her fellow revolutionary TERRA, who is something of a nervous wreck throughout the opening stages of this game. CELES is also shown to be honour-bound and almost an obsessive samurai-esque, sort of Bushido sense of the word. And although we already have a character who's analogous to the traditional samurai in the form of CYAN, CELES shows multiple moments where she's willing to, sacrifice herself to save her friends. Most poignantly when she stabs Kefka, and also she spirits herself and Kefka away, using magic to give her friends time to escape the Magitech factory. And finally, on this note, if Sid dies in the game events, which is a variable in the game, CELES does attempt suicide by throwing herself off a cliff. And, arguably this is out of grief rather than some honor-bound seppuku sort of thing. There's still this strong sense of, honor and commitment from her to her friends and the cause. Turning next to EDGAR, this guy is probably one of my personal favourite characters because against the backdrop of CELES and Locke and TERRA, who all confront some personal trauma, he's comparatively light-hearted and optimistic when it comes to confronting the quest in front of him. This humorous dynamism of EDGAR and his promiscuous nature, is really quite funny, and talking to the NPCs around Castle Figaro, it reveals that he's essentially attempting to sleep with every female in the castle, which actually borders on uncomfortable in places because, you speak to little girls and they're saying that he wants to marry them, and then later in the game when you meet Realm, he asks how old she is and then expresses his hope that she's still around when she reaches 18, which is quite perverse. But anyway, Edgar's role as an engineer and a machinist emphasises the quintessence of Final Fantasy VI, which is a world in the midst of a steampunk-esque industrial revolution. His relevance to the story is quite prevalent early on, and to this end his inventive Castle Figaro arguably serves as the first mode of transport. Now, I would argue that Edgar as a character is inspired by the European Age of Enlightenment, during the 18th century. His rationalist, pragmatic nature and interest in technology and industry makes this seem quite likely, because it's reflective of Enlightenment thinkers who were inspired by the Greeks, such as Aristotle and Plato. But actually, the philosopher who I mentioned earlier, John Locke, is in this school of people as well. So I think perhaps there was some sort of Enlightenment imagery and thought processes taken by Square, that informed this game. But beyond this aspect of his personality, I would argue this case even more because Edgar's fashion sense and his aesthetics, from his frock coat right down to his little ponytail, is also distinctly reflective of men's fashion from the 18th century onwards. So I think there's further contrast to make here, with this period of history. And going back, touching on duality again, when I discuss Sabin, I think where Westernism is very embedded in Edgar, both aesthetically and in terms of his personality, I would say that Sabin is actually distinctly Eastern in his appearance and personality, which again kind of plays into this duality and this contrast and yin and yang between these two characters. Now, despite being more optimistic compared to his prominent party members, Edgar does have his share of trauma too, and his relationship to his brother and his role as King Figaro is developed in game, where we learn that this sibling, Edgar, was burdened and honour-bound to rule in his murdered father's stead. Now, although King Figaro expressed that he wanted the brothers to rule equally, Sabin, who is the more volatile and emotional of the two, literally fled civilization in his grief and anger at the father's passing. So this is a really interesting aspect of the game, and the dynamic between these two characters, which I've touched on, and I'll go on to explain when I discuss Sabin. But as I've said, there's this recurring theme of duality between them, and their respective decisions at this moment in time, after their father dies, marks this strong contrast between them. Edgar is pragmatic and honour-bound and logical, whereas Sabin is emotional and spiritual and volatile. So, I think these temperaments are echoed in their job classes as well, with Edgar being a machinist and Sabin being a monk and a brawler. So it's a really nice little thread of story and symbolism that's expressed between these two, right through to their gameplay and battle dynamics. Looking at Sabin now, I suppose there's not too much to add, having discussed Edgar, besides this aforementioned, pragmatism versus, emotional, this emotional disposition, and how Sabin kind of favoured eloping into solitude and this Spartan lifestyle following the death of his father. Now, you'd be hard pushed to call Sabin dishonourable because of this, but his approach to grief is entirely at odds with his brothers, and once we recruit him in-game, he conveys a strong degree of guilt at having left his brother to pick up the pieces. So, I mentioned that Edgar's personality and appearance is inspired by European Enlightenment, and looking at Sabin and this duality, I would argue that Sabin's personality and appearance is inspired much more by Eastern practices, such as Shintoism, Hinduism and Buddhism. Firstly, he isolates himself on a mountain in order to meditate and train on what his masters taught him, which has clear connotations with Buddhist practices and how isolated meditation can help deconstruct the ego and this distinction between self and other. Secondly, Sabin is practiced in the martial arts, which are again attributable to warrior monk faculties, and his baggy harem trousers are similar to the styles that you see across India and Southeast Asia. His impulsive temperament also plays out quite credibly in the game's story, I think, and for example, his selfless rescue of TERRA from the hands of ULTROS sees him thrown from the raft and embark on his own brief kind of sideline journey. And there's some humorous transactions that occur as well once we see him teamed up with CYAN off the back of this, who's very stereotypically the straight man, the guy that has no sense of humour. And Sabin plays this clowning second fiddle, which bears a resemblance to buddy cop movies of the 90s. And finally, Sabin's physical aptitude and again this martial prowess and stuff informs his battle characteristics, and he has this really nice blitz command, which sees me utilising him actually quite often. So yeah, this mix of comic relief and credible dialogue, just make him generally a good character to have around. And I think the two brothers are, for me, two of the strongest members of the party in this game. So, as I've touched on CYAN already, I'll move on to profiling him now. And his character is very overtly a rendition and reimagining of the traditional samurai class of feudal Japan, not only by his attire and his special skill, which is called Bushido, but also by his nature as an honour-bound retainer to his kingdom. And once he's been slighted and once his citizens have been killed, he's completely driven by this sense of honour and revenge. Most poignantly, of course, his family gets killed, which comes immediately after his introduction to the game. So it provides a credible, albeit quite short-lived story arc and relevance to him, joining the party. Which is not to say he's a bad character, but his arc is quite small and brief. Yeah. So, similar to Adalbert Steiner from Final Fantasy IX, CYAN's proprietary sort of language is often exploited humorously, and, as I've touched upon, his dialogue with characters like Sabin is really quite funny, and the way that it's been translated by Woolsey is, in the dialogue, they're using Shakespearean thy and thou, to convey the propriety sort of nature of CYAN. As the game progresses, CYAN's relevance kind of slips into obscurity, unfortunately, but as a technophobe and a traditionalist, he does show an interest in learning more about technology and engineering, which is quite humorous and funny to see, because at the end of the world, he can be found on Mount Zozo, reading books about engineering and technology in an effort to sort of update himself and modernise himself and understand, at least, people like EDGAR, who are really pushing forth with modernity in this game. And I think this is quite a subtle but interesting look at how CYAN's interactions with the party have opened his mind to a new way of doing things. And personally, having read a few books about the history of Japan, which I'm quite obsessed with, I found quite a tangible reference there between CYAN and his interest in technology and the Japanese infatuation with Dutch inventions that started flowing into the country once they opened their doors to European trade. So, turning now to look at Shadow, this guy is a very conscious enigma introduced in Final Fantasy VI, he appears long before he becomes playable, and Nobuo Uematsu's excellent score, always precedes his presence and his appearance, when you enter a pub or an inn, for example. And I think this is great because it consistently alludes to some significance about him, but there's also this elusiveness towards the game's main events and, the central party. I think this character dynamic is fantastic as he's kind of dangled in front of the player, so close yet so far as this, elusive guy that you want to obtain and sort of, join the party. And it isn't really something we've seen in any Final Fantasy before or since, where you have this guy that's so impermanent and yet recurring at the same time. So yeah, it's a really interesting character, Shadow is, in terms of his introduction and consistency within the gameplay. Now, Shadow could be considered analogous to other retentive enigmas such as Vincent Valentine or Amarant Coral, but he has more contextual depth offered in game than these guys, and certainly more so than Amarant at least. And it's open to the player if they want to go looking for it. And if you choose to utilise Shadow, some insight into his personality and past is offered in dreams, which explains, the backstory of his character. Also, as I've touched upon, unlike Amarant and Vincent, who are initially enigmas but join the party permanently in due course, Shadow is a character that has a true ambiguity to him and his allegiances. Further to Shadow's character arc is probably the best unspoken allusion in Final Fantasy, prior to Laguna and Squall's connection in Final Fantasy VIII, which was fantastic. And this, of course, is that Shadow is the father of Realm. So this is conveyed through subtleties such as Shadow's dog Interceptor showing an instant affection for Realm whenever they're around together. And this is to the extent that the dog, usually so inseparable from his master, kind of wanders off with this child, leaving Shadow quite confused. I think whether Shadow is aware of Realm, as his daughter, is perhaps less significant and heart-wrenching than the lack of emoting that he does with her in the game. I think the only thing he actually says to her is "get back, he bites" when she first meets the dog Interceptor. And this stunted and unrealised relationship between them, which could have altered both their lives for the better had there been some emoting and discussion going on, and this reveal, is an example of how Final Fantasy VI is so much less rose-tinted and romanced than other installments of this series. And instead it opted for some quite hard truths and realism, I suppose, with the characters and stories, because it's possible for Shadow to die during the game events without ever having known the truth about Realm, which is really harrowing that things don't always work out in the end, that sort of thing. Also, it's quite amusing, again, like I said, I'd done a recent playthrough, and I always thought Shadow's humanity kind of shined through when he came to rescue the party from the burning house at Thamasa. And I later realised actually that it was the dog that entered the burning building to save Realm. So Shadow actually entered to try and save his dog, which I found quite an interesting and morally grey aspect of his character, which is, makes him all the more interesting, I think. Moving finally on to SETZER for the heroes, who's the last one I'm going to discuss. This is the final somewhat significant character we encounter, as he exemplifies the gambler's ambivalence towards the political events, that transpire, and it prompts and he's responsible for the second act taking place, because we acquire his airship and then can, venture to new areas of the game map. Now, unlike Shadow, who fights for the highest bidder, SETZER is more of an opportunist and a gambler who contrasts starkly with the returners and their strong moral convictions. Now, there's two origin stories for SETZER, depending on which version of Final Fantasy VI you play, and the early release explained that he is one of these haunted past kind of characters, which is far too similar to Locke and Shadow, I think, to have to introduce, a third character with that background. But the Steam release, which is the one I've been playing recently, is much more in keeping with the original, which simply shows SETZER as a gambler who considers the Empire bad for business, and that's really only, the only reason why he decides to join the Returners permanently. Now, many Final Fantasy fans will know that Square have long held the Star Wars series in high regard, and numerous tropes, such as the recurring characters of Biggs and Wedge, have served as homages to this film franchise. However, looking at the character of SETZER, I've long since felt a glimmer of Han Solo in there, and I felt that Tetsuya Nomura either consciously or unconsciously developed in, this personality trait that was very similar to Solo. So, looking at the surface level characteristics of SETZER, we see an opportunist and a gambler, which, and he also happens to be a very adept pilot, in command of a flying rarity, which is the Blackjack. So, we could consider this as analogous to the Millennium Falcon and Han Solo being this Chancellor and this gambler, who we come across at the beginning of the Star Wars films. So, true enough, this is a theory that I've kind of just developed on my own. There's no factual basis for it. But I have a degree of conviction, having seen these correlations, that there may have been some Solo sort of inspiration when developing the character of SETZER. So, returning to the story of SETZER, he seems to combine the lost love angle of Locke with the vanity and promiscuity of Edgar, which seems quite a jarring persona, actually, that's explored more thoroughly by his two comrades. He's one of these cool characters, I think, that Square tends to turn up in a Final Fantasy game. But sadly, he doesn't get too much say or story arc in the game. It's just often the case with the last characters you're introduced to, because it's on the cusp of the final act, so you're basically focusing on defeating the Empire and getting into these main stories, rather than delving into the personalities and the backgrounds of these later characters, such as SETZER. So, having said that, he is very decisive to the party's venture into Vector and the endgame rescue sequences, where his gambling nature actually is assuaged by intuitiveness. It's also worth noting that SETZER is one of the 3 key characters that you complete the game with as well in the World of Ruin, so his relevance to the ending and the role as a pilot is actually quite canonical and necessary, to the machinations of Final Fantasy VI. Finally, as mentioned previously, there's a lot of European naming conventions offered up in Final Fantasy VI, and the name SETZER GABBIAN is a prime example of Italian etymology, yet again, that I think we find in this game. Now, before moving on to Kefka, who is the antagonist most worthy of discussion in this game, and not just in this game really, but in Final Fantasy as a series in general, such is his legacy as a ruthless entity, I want to take a moment to discuss ULTROS very briefly, who holds some significance as the game's second most recurring villain, I think, besides Kefka. And I would argue actually that ULTROS is very much similar to Kefka in his anarchistic and iconoclastic disposition. Where Kefka revels in actively evil actions, however, ULTROS just does things to see what happens, for the sake of it. He's this mischievous prankster without any real motive, and, arguably the real antagonist behind Final Fantasy VI. No, I'm kidding. But, ULTROS does hold some cultural significance among Final Fantasy fans, either as something, quite frustrating and, a frustratingly recurrent boss, or as an amusing addition, that breaks the severity of the storyline. People perceive him in either one of those two ways. Personally, for me, I really liked the character of ULTROS, and I think that using the humour, and it was humour done well as well, it wasn't kind of crap and annoying, introducing him, but I felt he broke up the quite harrowing important moments quite well. I mean, like when you discover the 3 warring triad statues, it seems like this pivotal moment of the game, and then ULTROS shows up, and when you're flying to the floating continent, you think you're getting to this kind of end game sequence with Kefka, and then ULTROS shows up. I think he's a good example of how Square have used humour well. They've balanced it well with the more more pressing and serious aspects of the game story. So yeah, I think ULTROS is a great introduction to this game. Now, turning to the character of Kefka, at first glance, this guy he just seems to be a recurring general throughout the early game who, executes the commands of his emperor. And to this end, this setup as a main antagonist is something of a red herring, and it's the likes of which we see in some Final Fantasy games, but particularly Final Fantasy 15, which, much like Final Fantasy 6, has the true enemy hiding in plain sight as a sort of go-between between the Empire and the party. And to this end, I think Gestahl is a really well-structured red herring antagonist before Kefka takes over. And I think Gestahl is interesting because he evolves to be much more of a tragic, foolish villain, like Shakespeare's King Lear, whose hubris and lust for control gets the better of him in the end. And this Shakespearean allegory extends to some degree to Kefka as well, because, again, much like King Lear and many other Shakespeare plays, the character of the fool or the clown is always lingering to one side, deceptively innocuous, but always harbouring an ulterior motive, or some knowledge or desire of the events that are transpiring. And I think this perfectly embodies the relationship between King Lear and his fool, but also Kefka and Gestahl, the latter of which thinks Kefka is just, crazy but controllable at least, and in allegiance with him, right up until his anarchistic goals become clear and it's far too late for Gestahl to survive. This idea of the King's Fool also lends itself to Kefka's visual styling, as a bizarre court jester, harlequin, clownish figure. And just relating briefly back to the Italian themes and conventions we have in Final Fantasy VI, it's prudent to note that harlequins have origins in Italian theatre. So the visuals, along with Kefka's surname, Palazzo, once again firmly plants him in these geographical, Italian roots that, I've been discussing thus far. Now, regarding personality, Kefka, he's popularly labelled as a purely psychopathic individual by reviewers and commentators. And while this is in the right arena of classification, it's arguably not quite the case. So for me, Kefka exhibits a sociopathic rather than psychopathic demeanour, and a fundamentally nihilistic perception of life, which outdoes most, if not all, Final Fantasy villains we've seen so far. Rather than controlling or rebuilding the world in his own image, as many Final Fantasy villains do, Kefka's goal is purely destruction, of both world and self. The closest comparison I can make with this would probably be Seymour from Final Fantasy X, who has the same end-of-days outlook as Kefka, but exhibits a psychopathic rather than sociopathic nature. And this is to say that Seymour lacks emotions, and he has a very narcissistic and deceptive edge. He plots things very carefully when hatching his plans, and this makes his personality categorically psychopathic. Kefka, on the other hand, is openly and uncontrollably emotional. He's very primitive and hostile, flying into fits of rage, as exhibited by his arbitrary murder of Leo. And he generally works his way through situations by violence and emotion, letting the chips fall where they may. So this lack of self-control falls within the arena of sociopathy, as Kefka's outlook on life as well is nihilistic, which is rooted firmly in an emotional and pessimistic worldview. Psychopaths, on the other hand, usually lack emotion, so are capable of acting in a more disarming and calculating way, which, again, Seymour, who we just mentioned. So the big reveal regarding Kefka's perceptions of life come during the final battle, where he notes how hopes and dreams and life are fundamentally meaningless. And I suppose at this point, we could almost pity him, as a quite a clearly antisocial mental disorder, that he has. If we look at extended universe material such as Dissidia, strides have been taken to capitalise more on this sympathetic edge to his character. But suffice it to say, Kefka's actions posit him as a firmly ruthless antagonist, who undoubtedly takes pleasure from acts of evil, such as poisoning the population of Doma, and he fuels himself on hate and rage, as seen by basically every act he commits in the game and every moment he's on screen. The genius is that this relentless aggression is bound up with comedy as well. Kefka often cracks darkly humorous jokes and flees battles and has amusing sprite animations, which compounds this sort of madness and contradictions of the character, but it also shows how Final Fantasy VI is, is quite genius in the way it weaves comedy and tragedy together, again, as duality, as the game's core narrative. Turning to Kefka's origins, which are, scant recorded in the game, we know for a fact that he was an elite soldier, and basically he was selected as the first test subject for Cid's Magitech fusion program, and the results of which basically sent him mad and account for his attire and demeanour, by the time we start playing the game. There's a blueprint for Sephiroth here, I think, with this scientific meddling, and I think it went on to become a recurring theme in Square games, such as, the manufacture of black mages in Final Fantasy IX, and the Forbidden Machina in Final Fantasy X. So scientific meddling has a very, from 6 onwards, has a very important role to play in the narratives of these games. The relationship between Kefka and other characters is actually quite nuanced in this game, but there's a clear animosity between himself and Leo, the latter of which emphasises this sense of honour and duty and discipline, and Kefka again exhibits this uncontrollable madness and emotional instability. So again, it's this binary opposition and duality, as I keep referring back to this theme of duality, but we can see this exhibited by these two soldiers here, which makes CELES, just relating back to her, all the more interesting, because she's sort of in the middle, she's in between these two guys with her personal issues. So a final note on Kefka is perhaps quite an anticlimactic observation, but it's one that's quite commonly made, so it's worth noting here, and that's the Christian allegory apparent in the tower he crafts for himself during the endgame. He posits himself as a godhead with a levelled tower, and this draws parallels with Dante's Divine Comedy, in which the author is led by the angel Virgil through various circles of hell in the first book, Inferno, and then the various circles of purgatory and heaven in the books Purgatorio and Paradiso. So this ties in with Square's penchant for acrimonious portrayals of Christianity, much like Sephiroth being a seraphim angel and Yevon being a image of Catholicism. But more importantly for me, this reference to Dante again relates back to this Italian literary heritage and etymological heritage and visual heritage that we see in Final Fantasy VI, because of course Dante Alighieri was an Italian poet and statesman. So again, I think we have this Italian, root in Final Fantasy VI shining through yet again. I've referred back to the Western thing quite a lot, but it's important to note that this was the first real push into something distinctly foreign, for a Japanese audience, and using Western Renaissance and medieval terms, themes, and aesthetics. And I think this is something that Square has relentlessly gone towards into the present day, this westernization of Final Fantasy. And just to punctuate this point, the antagonist Ardyn in Final Fantasy XV was designed by Roberto Ferrari, who is an Italian concept artist who Square have basically employed entirely because they're trying to give these games a distinctly Western and Mediterranean vibe as they move further into the future. But I think it's relevant to note that now, because I think Final Fantasy VI was the real turning point for when they started westernizing these games and this trajectory into making them go mainstream, as it were. So, as usual, I've spoken for way too long, but edging towards a conclusion here, it's worth commenting on the soundtrack, as Final Fantasy VI features some poignant scores that, much like the game itself, have arguably been overlooked due to next-generation games and the milestone of the switch to 3D, which came with Final Fantasy VII. So, for me in particular, TERRA's theme and the boss music, Decisive Battle, are at the forefront of my gaming playlists to this day, and they have an endurability to them that affirms Uematsu's skill and legacy within the industry. We have to remember the limitations of composition software and sound cards back then. So, listening to these scores, we can really appreciate, despite being MIDI files, that they have this emotional potency to them that puts many current generation soundtracks to shame, I think. It's also worth noting that this was the first Final Fantasy to give individual characters their own themes, which is fitting because, as we've discussed, it's a firmly ensemble game and cast, each with their own prominence within the story. So, giving their own respective soundtracks, again draws attention to the fact that each of these characters has their own tale to tell. So, Final Fantasy VI is definitely a strong instalment on the soundtrack front for me, and I think it's thanks to Distant Worlds and talented YouTube musicians, actually, that we're seeing a revival and an upgrade of many of these compositions to real-world instruments. So, to conclude, finally, Final Fantasy VI was a groundbreaking game that brought dense interlocking narratives and individual character stories to the forefront for the first time. It took a brave leap into an industrial steampunk universe, which served as the blueprint for future installments, and specifically Final Fantasy VII, which ran with and popularised these themes and settings even more. The lacklustre re-release on Steam has been a contentious issue for both legacy and new fans, but without a doubt, there's going to hopefully be an appetite for a full remake along the lines of Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy III that I can't help but agree would do this title a lot of justice. So that's it for Final Fantasy VI. Thanks for listening, and once again, if you like the clip, please feel free to like and comment below, and also subscribing, which really helps support my channel and allows me to keep creating content more consistently in the future.